Categorizing a primary domicile as a yielding asset represents a fundamental accounting error in the mechanical allocation archetype. Standard financial models misidentify personal shelter as a generator of kinetic capital. This error persists due to psychological sentiment overriding forensic balance sheet analysis. The allocator views the deed as a trophy of stability. The data suggests it is an anchor of illiquidity. The acquisition creates an immediate and persistent drag on the optionality index. Sentimental value provides zero compounding velocity. It is a liability disguised as an equity engine. The psychological pride associated with home ownership acts as a cognitive dampener. It masks the mechanical reality of the transaction. The allocator believes they are investing. The forensic audit proves they are consuming. A productive asset pays the allocator for the privilege of ownership. A primary residence demands a continuous subsidy. This is the distinction between an asset and a structural burden. Sentiment is irrelevant in a capital physics equation. Only the direction of capital flow matters. Analyze the first 60 months of a standard 30-year amortized mortgage schedule. In the initial 5-year window, capital distribution is skewed heavily toward interest expense. This is static friction in its purest mechanical form. The allocator contributes monthly liquidity, yet the principal reduction is marginal. Interest payments represent a total loss of capital momentum. For a standard $400,000 allocation at current market rates, the data suggests that over 70% of the initial capital outflow is non-recoverable. The institutional lender captures the early-stage kinetic energy of the allocator's labor. This is a systemic transfer of wealth. It is masked by the terminology of equity building. Actual equity growth remains stagnant while the interest burn is rapid. Mechanical probability dictates that the first 60 months serve the lender's balance sheet exclusively. The allocator carries 100% of the risk. The lender captures the majority of the initial yield. The math is unapologetic. The acquisition of a primary residence triggers an immediate expansion of the maintenance tax. Property taxes represent a recurring fee for the right to exist in a specific geographic coordinate. This tax is variable and trends upward. Structural decay requires constant capital injections to maintain basic operational efficiency. Roofs, vac systems, and plumbing are all high-friction components. They possess a finite functional lifespan. These are not optional upgrades. They are required subsidies to prevent the total failure of the structure. Insurance premiums are a mandatory hedge against catastrophic failure. They offer zero positive yield. The house does not provide liquidity to the allocator. The allocator serves as a continuous power source for the house. Every dollar directed toward this structure is a dollar removed from automated defensive moats. This capital is now static capital. It cannot be reallocated. It cannot react to market inefficiencies. It sits in drywall and timber while inflation erodes its future purchasing power. The maintenance tax remains high regardless of market fluctuations. If the market value of the structure drops, the tax and maintenance requirements remain constant or increase. The house is a consumption engine. It is fueled by the allocator's finite liquidity. The opportunity cost is the loss of the optionality index. Locked capital cannot pivot to high-yield opportunities. It is trapped in a non-yielding shell. The forensic auditor views the 30-year mortgage not as a path to wealth, but as a 3-decade liquidity trap. The belief that leasing shelter is a total loss of capital is a flawed narrative. Leasing is a flat fee for the use of a utility. Homeownership is an uncapped liability for the maintenance of a utility. The data suggests that when the maintenance tax and static friction are calculated, the cost of ownership often exceeds the cost of a lease over a 10-year horizon. The capital saved by leasing can be deployed into productive assets. These assets create automated defensive moats. The house provides only shelter. It does not provide security. It provides a fixed geographic liability. The allocator must acknowledge the mechanical reality. Shelter is a cost of existence. It is not a vehicle for capital expansion. Misidentifying this cost as an investment leads to systemic failure. It traps capital in an illiquid state. This reduces the allocator's ability to respond to systemic changes. The 30-year mortgage is a mechanism for long-term labor extraction. It ensures the allocator remains tethered to a specific geographic and financial coordinate. The data suggests that the true cost of a $400,000 home over 30 years often exceeds $1 million. This includes interest, taxes, insurance, and maintenance. This is a 150% markup on a non-yielding asset. A forensic audit reveals the structural inefficiency. High-status allocators prioritize liquidity. Low-status participants prioritize the illusion of ownership. The capital physicist prioritizes the optionality index. The house is a drain on that index. The amortization schedule is designed to front-load the institution's profit. This is a deliberate mechanical feature. The allocator's equity is backloaded. This ensures that the institution is paid first. The allocator takes the tail risk of market corrections. If the market value drops 10%, the bank's interest is already secured. The allocator's equity is destroyed. This is an asymmetrical risk profile. Static friction is the silent killer of wealth velocity. It is the resistance caused by taxes and interest. It prevents capital from moving. A primary residence has the highest static friction of any common asset class. It is physically immobile. It is financially illiquid. It is legally encumbered. The forensic auditor identifies this as a strategic failure. To win the game of capital physics, one must minimize static friction. The 30-year mortgage maximizes it. The data confirms the diagnosis. The primary residence is a systemic liquidity trap. Equity trapped within a primary domicile is classified as static capital. Its internal rate of return is zero. The allocator often celebrates the accumulation of home equity as a milestone of wealth. The forensic audit reveals a different reality. This equity is frozen kinetic energy. It performs no labor. It generates no yield. It sits as a dormant entry on a balance sheet while the allocator continues to fund the maintenance tax with external liquidity. Mechanical probability dictates that capital locked in drywall cannot participate in the global compounding cycle. The optionality index of a primary residence is mathematically negligible. A productive business asset, a core Buffett principle, generates a passive kinetic yield. It produces the cash flow necessary to offset its own maintenance costs and fund further acquisitions. A house operates on the inverse mechanical principle. It requires a continuous infusion of the allocator's finite liquidity to prevent structural failure. This creates a systemic drain on the total net velocity of the individual's portfolio. The data suggests that every $100,000 of debt equity represents a loss of $10,000 or more in annual compounding potential, assuming a baseline 10% market yield. This loss of velocity is compounding. Over a 20-year horizon, the delta between static capital in a home and kinetic capital in a productive asset is catastrophic. The allocator is not merely losing the interest they pay to the bank. They are losing the future value of the capital they have saved in their walls. This is the opportunity cost tax. It is the most expensive levy in the capital physics universe. It is unpaid, unrecorded, and mathematically undeniable. Productive assets are engineered to build automated defensive moats. A high-quality business possesses pricing power to counteract inflation. A primary residence possesses no such mechanism. It is a victim of inflation. While the nominal price of the domicile may increase, the cost of the inputs required to maintain it, labor, materials, energy, scales at an equal or greater rate. The data suggests that when adjusted for the maintenance tax and the cost of capital, the real return on a primary residence over a 30-year period is often near zero or negative. The allocator is also subject to extreme geographic concentration risk. A primary residence represents a massive leverage bet on a single neighborhood, a single municipality, and a single local economy. This is a violation of sound mechanical allocation archetypes. If the local tax authority increases the maintenance tax, the allocator has no recourse. If the local economic engine fails, the liquidity of the asset evaporates. The allocator is tethered to a sinking coordinate. A mobile, liquid portfolio of productive assets allows for rapid reallocation. A house demands a total commitment to a fixed point in space. Leverage in home ownership is often praised as a benefit. The forensic auditor views it as a magnification of risk. A 5-5-1 leverage ratio on a productive asset is high. A 10-1 or 20-1 leverage ratio on a house, common in low down payment scenarios, is extreme. This leverage is applied to a non-productive asset. If the market value of the structure decreases by 10%, a 10% down payment is erased. The allocator's equity is destroyed, yet the debt remains. This is an asymmetrical failure. The institution holds the security, the allocator holds the risk. The illusion of rent saving is a primary driver of this systemic failure. The allocator calculates the cost of a lease versus a mortgage payment. They fail to account for the static friction of transaction costs. Entering and exiting a domicile transaction typically consumes 6 to 10% of the total asset value in commissions, fees, and taxes. For a $500,000 asset, this is a $50,000 friction loss. A liquid allocation into a productive business incurs near zero friction. The allocator must overcome a massive negative balance just to reach a break-even state in home ownership. The data suggests that the average duration of home ownership is approximately 7 to 10 years. This timing ensures that the allocator is perpetually stuck in the front-loaded interest phase of the amortization schedule. They exit the first house just as the principal reduction begins to accelerate, only to restart the 30-year clock on a more expensive domicile. This is a cycle of perpetual debt service. It ensures the allocator never reaches the state of kinetic momentum required for true capital independence. True capital efficiency requires the conversion of labor into kinetic capital. The primary residence prevents this conversion. It acts as a terminal for liquidity. Once capital enters the equity of a domicile, it is removed from the board. It can no longer be used to buy undervalued businesses during a market correction. It can no longer be used to hedge against systemic instability. It is a hostage to the structure. The capital physicist identifies the primary residence as a strategic bottleneck. It limits the allocator's ability to pivot. It dictates their labor requirements. It consumes their most productive years in the service of a non-yielding utility. High-status allocators utilize the rent and invest model to maintain a high optionality index. They pay for the utility of shelter with the yield from their assets. They do not use their seed capital to purchase the utility itself. The mechanical reality is that a house is a liability that the market occasionally misprices as an asset. Relying on this periodic mispricing for wealth generation is a systemic gamble. It is not a principle of capital allocation. To win the game of compounding, one must minimize static capital and maximize kinetic capital. The 30-year mortgage is the primary mechanism used by the system to ensure the opposite occurs. The audit is clear. The American dream of home ownership is a forensic nightmare of misallocated capital. A primary residence is a physical structure governed by the laws of entropy. It is an assembly of timber, concrete, and copper. These materials possess finite operational lifespans. They are in a state of constant degradation. Environmental stressors ensure this decay. Moisture infiltration, thermal expansion, and ultraviolet radiation are persistent mechanical threats. The structure does not grow, it erodes. This is the core mechanical failure of the asset class. The allocator is engaged in a continuous battle against material expiration. This is not a choice. It is a structural requirement. The forensic audit reveals a relentless extraction via phantom costs. These are the non-recoverable capital outflows required to maintain basic functional utility. Structural degradation is a certainty. A roof is a 20-year liability. An HVAC system is a 15-year liability. Mechanical probability suggests these systems will fail within their specified windows. Replacing them is not an upgrade. It is a restoration to the baseline. The capital is consumed. It is not captured in the equity. The data proves that localized property tax hikes act as a variable levy on ownership. These costs are decoupled from the asset's performance. They reflect the municipal requirement for liquidity. The homeowner is the primary source of this liquidity. Insurance premium surges represent a forced hedge against catastrophic failure. High-frequency environmental events have recalibrated risk models. These costs are mandatory for the 30-year mortgage holder. The lender requires the protection. The allocator funds the premium. This is a systemic transfer of wealth to the insurance industrial complex. The house is a conduit for this extraction. Every repair and every tax payment increases the static friction of the portfolio. The house is not paying the allocator is feeding the house. The forensic reality of appreciation exposes a profound mathematical deception. A domicile purchased for $300,000 and sold for $600,000 after 3 decades appears to be a success. This is a 100% nominal gain. The capital physicist rejects this conclusion. Subtract the cumulative mortgage interest. Subtract 30 years of property taxes and insurance. Subtract the recurring cost of structural maintenance. Subtract the capital injections for system replacements. Subtract the transaction fees and commissions at the point of exit. The real return is mathematically negligible. In many jurisdictions, the data suggests a negative real yield. The asset barely maintains purchasing power parity. It is a store of value that leaks. It is a bucket filled with holes. The appreciation is consumed by the maintenance tax before it is ever realized. The allocator is holding a depreciating physical core while paying a premium for the illusion of growth. The nominal price increase is merely a reflection of currency debasement. It is not an expansion of wealth. Timber frames are susceptible to biodegradation. Termites and rot are features of the material, not flaws in the design. The allocator must deploy capital to mitigate these biological stressors. Concrete foundations are subject to hydrostatic pressure. Cracks are inevitable. Repairing a foundation requires massive capital injections with zero return on investment. The allocator is subsidizing a failing structure to prevent a total loss. This is the definition of a defensive liability. Copper piping oxidizes. Electrical systems become obsolete as safety codes update. Exterior paint fails every 7 to 10 years. These are scheduled capital extractions. They are predictable. Most allocators fail to model these events. They view a failing water heater as an unfortunate anomaly. The capital physicist views it as a calculated mechanical expiration. The system is designed to fail. It is designed to be replaced. This ensures a constant flow of capital from the allocator back into the economy. The homeowner is the final destination of this capital cycle. They are the payer. They are never the payee. The total cost of ownership over 3 decades is staggering. The data proves that the cumulative non-recoverable outflow often exceeds the initial purchase price. If an allocator pays $400,000 for a domicile, they will likely spend an additional $400 to $600,000 in taxes, interest, and maintenance over 30 years. To achieve a break-even state in real terms, the house must appreciate by 250% or more. Historical data suggests this is a statistical anomaly. Most structures follow the inflation curve. They do not exceed it. The house is a parasitic mechanical system. It consumes labor to maintain a state of stasis. It does not produce. It only demands. The forensic auditor identifies the primary residence as a high-friction, low-yield utility. Labeling it an asset is a systemic error. The math is cold. The outcome is predictable. The allocator serves the structure. The structure does not serve the allocator. The maintenance tax is the mechanism that ensures the allocator remains a source of energy for the system rather than a beneficiary of it. High-status allocators prioritize capital velocity. Low-tier allocators prioritize physical possession. This is the fundamental divergence in mechanical allocation archetypes. Equity within a primary residence is classified as static mass. It possesses no kinetic energy. It performs no labor. It creates zero yield. For the forensic auditor, this represents a profound loss of potential energy. The low-tier allocator views a paid-off home as the ultimate security. The capital physicist views it as a vault that has been welded shut. The liquidity is trapped. The opportunity is neutralized. The mathematical inefficiency of the initial capital outlay is the primary driver of this failure. Consider the down payment. This is typically the largest single allocation of an allocator's career. It represents years of converted labor. When this liquidity is directed into a domicile, its internal rate of return drops to zero. It is buried in concrete and timber. It becomes dead capital. The data suggests that $100,000 deployed into a productive yield-bearing asset generates significant compounding heat. At a 10% baseline yield, that capital produces $10,000 in annual kinetic liquidity. Over a 30-year horizon, the delta between static mass and kinetic mass is catastrophic. That same $100,000 allocation, if left to compound in a broad market index or a high-moat business, would expand to nearly $1.75 million. This is the compounding heat that has been forfeited. By placing that capital into a house, the allocator has accepted a $1.75 million penalty in exchange for the utility of shelter. This is the opportunity cost tax. It is the most aggressive levy in the financial universe. It is never billed, yet it is always collected. The allocator is not building wealth. They are subsidizing a utility at the expense of their future optionality index. Mechanical probability dictates that a portfolio's strength is derived from its ability to regenerate. Kinetic assets produce the liquidity required to acquire more kinetic assets. This is the automated defensive moat in operation. A primary residence does not regenerate. It consumes. It demands a continuous external power source. If the allocator ceases to provide labor income, the structure does not assist. It remains a high-friction liability. It does not care about the status of the allocator's employment. It continues to demand the maintenance tax. It continues to demand the mortgage service. This creates extreme systemic fragility. The homeowner is tethered to a fixed geographic and financial liability. If the local economic engine fails, or if personal labor capacity is interrupted, the house becomes an active threat. It is a parasite that continues to feed even when the host is depleted. The asset does not provide liquidity during a crisis. It requires it. This is a structural failure of the highest order. A true asset provides defensive coverage during labor interruptions. A domicile accelerates the depletion of remaining liquidity. The data suggests that most homeowners are one labor interruption away from a total liquidity collapse. Their wealth is illiquid. It is locked in walls they cannot spend. They are house-heavy and cash-light. This is a state of suboptimal allocation. They possess the illusion of wealth but lack the mechanics of freedom. The house is a non-productive anchor. It prevents the allocator from pivoting to new opportunities. It forces them to remain in the service of the mortgage industrial complex. A high-status allocator maintains a high optionality index by keeping capital mobile. They understand that liquidity is the ultimate defensive weapon. They utilize the rent and invest model to ensure their capital is always in a state of kinetic growth. They pay for their shelter utility using the yield from their productive assets. This ensures the principal remains untouched and compounding. The low-tier allocator does the opposite. They exhaust their principal to buy the utility. This choice destroys their compounding velocity. The forensic auditor identifies the primary residence as a strategic bottleneck. It creates a state of static friction that permeates the entire balance sheet. The more equity an allocator has in their home, the less kinetic power they have in the market. This is the tragedy of the safe investment. It is only safe for the lender. For the allocator, it is a graveyard for seed capital. The math is unapologetic. The opportunity cost of a 30-year mortgage is the loss of generational momentum. The transition from a perceived asset to an active liability threat happens the moment labor income ceases. Without a continuous infusion of external liquidity, the domicile begins to fail. The taxes go unpaid. The maintenance is deferred. The debt service is missed. The structure that was supposed to provide security becomes the source of the allocator's destruction. The capital physicist avoids this failure by ensuring every dollar is assigned to a high-velocity, yield-bearing vehicle. They do not bury their seed capital. They plant it in fertile, productive ground. The house is not that ground. The audit is complete. Static mass is the enemy of capital expansion. The high-status allocator solves the biological requirement for shelter through a superior mechanical allocation archetype. They decouple the utility of a domicile from the pursuit of capital expansion. Shelter is a logistical necessity. It is not a financial engine. The data suggests that leasing shelter is the optimal strategy for maintaining a high optionality index. A lease is a fixed, mathematically capped liability. It represents the maximum monthly capital outflow for the utility. There are no surprise extractions. There is no structural decay risk for the occupant. Leasing transfers the entire maintenance tax to the property owner. The landlord absorbs the static friction of property taxes and insurance premiums. The landlord is responsible for the forensic decay of the structure. The allocator maintains total capital mobility. They are free to reallocate their liquidity to high-yield opportunities without the 10% friction of a real estate transaction. Geographic optionality is a critical defensive component. The allocator moves where the capital velocity is highest. They are not anchored to a single coordinate by an illiquid shell. The narrative that leasing is wasteful is a low-tier cognitive error. In reality, a lease buys liquidity. It buys time. It buys the ability to keep seed capital within automated defensive moats. The interest on a 30-year mortgage is the actual non-recoverable burn of kinetic energy. The maintenance tax is a non-recoverable burn. The opportunity cost of debt equity is a non-recoverable burn. The data confirms that the cumulative cost of these three factors often exceeds the cost of a lease over a decade-long horizon. A primary residence is a consumption choice. It is a luxury purchase, not a financial savior. The allocator must decouple their ego from the concept of real estate ownership. Ego is a dampener on rational analysis. If the objective is to optimize the optionality index, the capital must remain in motion. A house is a static mass. It is a destination for capital to die. High-status participants recognize this mechanical reality. They do not use seed capital to buy shelter. They use the kinetic yield from their established assets to fund their lifestyle utilities. The sequence of allocation is non-negotiable. First, establish automated defensive moats. Second, maximize the velocity of compounding. Only after the passive kinetic yield exceeds the total maintenance tax of a domicile should the purchase be considered. At this stage, the house is funded by the labor of the assets, not the labor of the allocator. This is the only rational path to long-term structural defense. The house is a liability. It must be treated as such on every forensic balance sheet. The goal of the capital physicist is not to possess a fixed structure. The goal is to possess the highest possible optionality index. This requires the elimination of static friction. It requires the rejection of the 30-year liquidity trap. It requires the relentless pursuit of capital velocity. Deploy capital into productive high-moat businesses. Minimize the maintenance tax. Prioritize liquidity over the illusion of stability. Execute the transition from static mass to kinetic capital. Prioritize systemic velocity over the perceived security of wood and stone. Eliminate the drag. Expand the index.